So, welcome to the next edition of the events that influenced the Battle of Britain, originally presented April 8th, 5 years ago, 2015, but we're being reprised for the online edition. And of course, this is being done for the Historic Flight Foundation. And originally it was done for the 75th anniversary, which of course, at this point, we're almost up to the 80th anniversary. So anyways, with no further ado, this is the real story of the British fighters versus the German fighters that were involved in the Battle of Britain. And so first of all, let's go over the opponents really quick so that we keep them in mind. The British fighters were the Hawker Hurricane 1, shown in the upper right there, and the Supermarine Spitfire 1 and 2, shown just to the left of that, and then the Boulton Paul Defiant, kind of an oddball, not very well known fighter, which is the black one down below the Hurricane. And then on the German side, the Messerschmitt 109E down below the Defiant, and then the Messerschmitt BF 110C to the left of that. And actually, I just realized that F should be lowercase. I apologize. BF stood for the Bavarian Flugzeugwerk, which is the company that became Messerschmitt, but they still used the BF acronym at the time of the Battle of Britain. And they only became Messerschmitt, I think, a year later, if I remember right. And they started using ME, if I remember right. Anyways, so let's first look at the principal designers. These are the guys that were the brains behind these designs. And at Hawker, we had Sidney Cam, who was kind of the legendary designer who worked on everything from the Fury biplane that preceded the Hurricane up through the Hawker Harrier, and just now leaving service. And in fact, he was a major driving force behind the Harrier. And then his right-hand man was Roy Chaplin, who was actually more the engineering hands-on guy. At Vickers Supermarine, which incidentally, Vickers owned Supermarine, so that's why I put Vickers in front of the name of the company. The brains behind the company was, behind the designs at least, was R.J. Mitchell, who was responsible for the Schneider Cup Trophy racers of the 1920s and 30s. Unfortunately, he died of cancer in 1937 after the Spitfire program had gotten rolling. And then Joseph Smith, shown to his left there, took over the program. And then the aerodynamicist responsible for a lot of the design work was Beverly Shenstone, shown on the far right. He was actually Canadian, had come over to work in the UK. And so we'll see, he was responsible actually for some of the technology that the British brought over from the United States to infuse into their design. And then at Boulton Paul, we have John Dudley North, who had been around for a while at Boulton Paul, and after the war continued on. Of course, Boulton Paul eventually got out of the airplane business altogether. And if I remember right, I think they make locomotive stuff now in the UK. I think they're still around. And then on the opposing side, we have Messerschmitt. I goofed on the previous slide. It's 1938, they switched over to being Messerschmitt. And Willie Messerschmitt was the manager of the company and responsible for design philosophies and just general layout and concepts. And then Robert Lednicer, shown to the right there, was his aerodynamicist. Now, if I remember right here, Robert Lednicer left Messerschmitt partway through the war, went to work at Heinkel, if I remember right. So anyways, development of the aircraft. So first of all, let's look at the Hurricane. The Hurricane, like a lot of other aircraft, was designed to a specification. It was laid down by the British Ministry of Procurement, if I remember right. It was spec, as I note there, F.5/34. And they wanted an interceptor monoplane with 8 machine guns and speeds in excess of 300 miles an hour. And one of these ways that chicken and the egg, Sidney Cam had been going to them with this idea for this new design. And so they wrote the spec basically to match what Sidney Cam had been pitching them. And it was actually a pretty conservative design for its time, 1935. As you can see in the upper right picture, it was space frame, which means that there was a frame within the skins that actually took the aerodynamic, well, all the loads, both inertial and aerodynamic. You can see in that upper right picture that the wing actually didn't originally have the conventional spar and truss structure that we're used to seeing in wings. Instead, it had like a Warren truss going down the middle originally. And at that point, the wings were fabric covered when it had that wing design. And of course, the fuselage was fabric covered from the cockpit back throughout its life. shortly before the Battle of Britain, production shifted over to a stress skin metal wing. So now instead of having all the loads carried by the internal structure, some of it was carried by the skins. And of course, the skins make it a little stronger and everything. And also, it was pretty unsophisticated airplane aerodynamically. The wings were a Clark Y airfoil, which really is kind of a dated airfoil. And only the Russians really hung on to that airfoil design after this time. And as you can see also in that lower right picture, the fuel was carried both in the inner wing, which is great, but some of it was also carried in a header tank up behind the instrument panel in the cockpit. And as we'll come to, that wasn't the world's safest thing to do, actually. The Spitfire, in contrast, was designed to a later specification. And here the Ministry of Procurement wanted a zone fighter with 4 machine guns, lower speed, but capable of more varied application. And once again, like the Hawker design, specification was basically written to match what Supermarine had been pitching them. And it was actually a very advanced design for its time in 1935. Had fully stressed skin metal fuselage and wing, so the aerodynamic and inertial loads were carried both through the skins, the frames, and the stringers, and had fairly sophisticated aerodynamics for its time too. Very nice, clean airplane. One drawback, though, as I note in the picture on the right, was all the fuel tanks were in the fuselage right ahead of the cockpit. And once again, as we get to, that wasn't the world's greatest thing and caused issues in combat. It also was a little short of fuel. So later in the war, when the need was there for longer range aircraft, the Spitfire had fuel added, but it wasn't able to get the range of something like a P-51 Mustang. But for its time, as a short range interceptor and area defense fighter, it was actually very, very good. And as we'll get to, very maneuverable, which is a real plus for it. The third airplane is the Defiant, which there was a specification laid out where they optimistically thought that they could have a 4-gun turret behind the pilot and no armament whatsoever in the wings, and that this aircraft could pull up next to bombers, the turret could shoot them down and move on to the next one. It was a bomber destroyer concept. It was fairly advanced design for its time, 1937 here. Had a stress skin metal fuselage and wing, modestly sophisticated aerodynamics, and the fuel was all out in the wings, which is a great idea. It did have drawbacks, and in fact, you can see in the upper left picture there, that pilot looks like he's wearing a great big diaper or an overall, and really that's how they had to wear their parachute because space was so limited in the turret. And you can also see in that picture that the turret is open for access right there. So to get in or out of the turret had to be turned 90 degrees to the side, as you see there. And that made it rather difficult, obviously, to get out of the aircraft in the event of an emergency, like being shot down. As you can see in the picture on the right, yeah, it looks really heavily armed, you might say, but those are actually 30 caliber machine guns, which in the end proved just not to be enough. But so that was the Boulton Paul Defiant. On the German side, we have the Messerschmitt 109. And this was laid out by Willy Messerschmitt to a specification, once again, from the German Luftwaffe. They wanted a fairly short range interceptor with a fairly okay top speed, about like what you see for the Spitfire, at about 20,000 feet. And they wanted to be able to get to 20,000 feet in 17 minutes. But they only required to have 90 minutes of fuel, which proved to be a drawback in the long run. It was a pretty advanced design for 1934. Originally, the aircraft flew with a Rolls-Royce Goshawk engine that had been imported into Germany for use in a Heinkel aircraft, and Messerschmitt borrowed it and got the first flight off with it. But they switched over to a Daimler-Benz 601A, of course, Benz being Mercedes-Benz, except with the full name of Daimler-Benz as opposed to Mercedes that they market cars under. It had a stress skin metal fuselage. It had fairly sophisticated aerodynamics. And interestingly enough, all the fuel is below the pilot and a little bit behind the pilot, which you wouldn't think would be that safe. But in the long run, that actually proved to be a pretty well protected position, and that actually panned out pretty decently. The drawback was it didn't have enough fuel, really. And they did have drop tanks for it, but they never were put into use during the Battle of Britain. And also in the upper right there, I show the development of the canopy of the aircraft. It started out with a nice rounded canopy for lower drag, but they quickly had to incorporate armored plate glass in, so it went to flat panels. which of course has an attendant drag increase, whatnot. And from what I've seen, it's also got a very tight cockpit. I'm told the pilots above about 5'10" have trouble fitting in the cockpit, both in terms of height, your head hitting the top, and also just shoulder width. It was pretty constrained. So they kind of designed a minimum airplane around the pilot. The Messerschmitt 110 was once again designed against a Luftwaffe or RLM Reich Luft Ministry, I believe it was, request. They wanted a longer range aircraft, now a twin engine and 3 seats, so a pilot, a navigator, co-pilot, and then gunner in this aft-facing gun you see in the upper right there. They wanted all metal, and they wanted armed with cannons. So it has cannons in the nose. And once again, remember, cannon is a gun that fires an exploding ammunition, which is obviously a bit more capable than just a machine gun, which fires bullets that are solid metal. There was stress skin metal fuselage and wing, and fairly sophisticated aerodynamics. And as I indicate in that lower right picture, the fuel was very wisely put out in the wing tanks, isolating it from the crew, which is a good safety measure. So the fire danger that I've alluded to with the Spitfire and the Hurricane is amply demonstrated here. So the Hurricane has this fuel header tank that was not isolated from the cockpit. It's right up above, behind the instrument panel. The Spitfire, at least, there was a bulkhead between the fuel tanks and the pilot, but even that was really insufficient in the end. Self-sealing capability in the fuel tanks and armor for the fuel tanks was added to Hurricanes and Spitfires during the Battle of Britain. So they actually started the battle without them. And interesting enough, the 109E did not have a self-sealing fuel tank, but it really didn't seem to hamper it. The 110 did have a self-sealing fuel tank. And the way they do that is they wrap the fuel tank in rubber. So if a bullet goes through, the rubber then closes up around the holes and keeps fuel from leaking. So that can easily be retrofitted. Nowadays, we also put foam in the tanks so that it helps proof the fuel tanks against explosion. So on the right there, I show the story of Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson, who was the only member of the fighter command to be awarded a Victoria Cross during the battle. And the reason he was is because his Hurricane was badly damaged in combat, and the fuel tank started leaking and caught fire. And so he went to bail out to get away from the flames, and he realized there was a German aircraft right in front of him. So what did he do? He climbed back in the cockpit, proceeded to shoot down the German aircraft, and then he bailed out. Now the photo below that is him before all this took place, and unfortunately he really suffered for it. He was very badly burned, and in fact some of the very early burn treatment work that was ever done was done for the pilots that were coming in badly burned from these air combat incidents. And the British came up with ways to disinfect the wounds, keep the wounds from having other issues, and also do skin grafts to bring the pilots back. And that's exactly how Nicholson was brought along. So the flying kit that the pilots wore was shown there on the right. The cockpits were not pressurized, so it gets kind of uncomfortable above about 25,000 feet in an unpressurized cockpit. They were breathing 100% oxygen above 15,000 feet, which itself is not that comfortable, kind of dries you out. And since it wasn't really, I don't believe it was full pressure breathing. It was harder to breathe at higher altitudes. The cockpits were reported to be well heated, but you might note there that pilot's pretty heavily dressed with insulated flying gear and gauntlets and boots and everything. G-suits were not invented yet. So what a G-suit does is it keeps, in air combat maneuvering, as you pull more G or load factor, your blood in your body tends to flow to your legs. And pilots nowadays wear G-suits that tighten up above your upper leg and keep the blood from flowing into your legs. And that enables you to tolerate higher Gs for longer periods. Well, obviously they weren't so equipped back then. So their amount of Gs that they could pull and sustain was limited. Of course, the other thing is we're used to pilots now wearing flight suits made of Nomex, or at least part Nomex, so they were fairly fire resistant. What the pilots back then were wearing was uniforms basically of cotton and wool that were not fire resistant. Of course, that too was an issue with the cockpit fires. The overwater survival suits the pilots now wear hadn't been invented yet. So if you bailed out, say over the North Sea, and went in the water, you had to be rescued probably in about 20 minutes or less, or hypothermia would set in and would kill you. So believe me, the introduction of overwater survival suits after the war was a big plus in that regard. That pilot's not wearing a crash helmet, so his head really is only protected by a leather skull cap of sorts. Of course, now when you see pilots flying World War II fighters, like when you see John fly the Spitfire, it looks like he's wearing a leather flying helmet, but he isn't. It's actually a crash helmet, kind of disguised, because it's worth having that kind of protection for your head. And then lastly, we take it for granted now that when a pilot's shot down, they have rescue radios that date back to the 50s and beacons so that they could call air sea rescue services to come get them. And back then, they didn't have them. I mean, someone had to see you be shot down and bail out and going into the water for you to actually have rescue services come out and get you. It wasn't like today where you could be on the radio while you're even under the parachute, letting people know where you are and what's going on. So yeah, there's been a lot of developments that have really helped since this time. From the aerodynamic standpoint, these are computational fluid dynamic solutions of the flow about the Spitfire. This is being a Spitfire 9 up in the upper left, which is post-Battle of Britain. And then a Messerschmitt 109F in the lower left, which again is post-Battle of Britain. The first thing you see is the hotter the color, in other words, the more red or magenta, the more suction is being carried in a given place in the airplane. So right away, the first thing you see is the canopy on the Spitfire, which bulges way out. There's a lot of suction on it. But more importantly, on the wing, the suction that actually provides the lift is very forward loaded on the wing. And that is in contrast to later design trends, which actually introduce more loading over the chord. And like with the P-51, you'll find loading all the way back to like 60 or 70%, which is a lower drag solution. But the Spitfire actually benefited from Beverly Shenstone going to the United States while it was early in its design process. And he got briefed on the NACA 4-digit airfoils that were being developed at the Langley Memorial Labs at the time, and realized they were good and could be used on his design, so he brought them back. And the wing of the Spitfire is actually National Advisory Committee for Aerodynamics from the United States. They're 2200 series airfoils, and it varies in thickness to chord ratio from the root to the tip. Similarly, the Germans have been keeping their eye on American technical publications and were aware of kind of an oddball set of airfoils that had been published. They're kind of lost to history in a lot of ways. They're called the R1 series, and there was actually an R2 series. And they show up in exactly one publication I've ever been able to find. And I've actually been able to recreate them, but the Germans latched onto them, and Messerschmitt in particular used them both on the 109 and the 110, and then some other designs. Interesting enough, as I mentioned earlier, the Hurricane was kind of an older generation as far as aerodynamics was concerned, and they used the Clark Y H airfoil, which is a derivative in the Y series. They've been developed late 20s, if I remember right, and it was used on the Hurricane. Was used on actually quite a few Russian airplanes during World War II. And since that time, actually, there's two other places I can think of where you could find it. Believe it or not, the horizontal tail of a Bell Jet Ranger is an inverted Clark Y. And Northrop built a low observable aircraft called Tacit Blue, and they wanted a flat bottom airfoil, and the Clark Y is that. So that's what's actually on Tacit Blue, interestingly enough. They went back to a pretty archaic airfoil. So this is showing some comparison of more modern designs. So you note, here on the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt, as they say, had a lot of forward loading on the airfoils. And so the leading edge area carried most of the load. If you look here on the Mustang on the upper left, the wing actually carries the load more uniformly across the chord, back to about 60 to 70%. And that allows laminar flow to exist to that point, potentially, and hence provides lower drag, and it's a better design from that standpoint. The Hawker Sea Fury you see in the lower right uses a Hawker airfoil, and it isn't as extreme as the Mustang, but once again, you can see it isn't as forward loaded. So these are later designs. So cooling systems on the aircraft. The Spitfire 1 and 2 show, as I show in that cross section on the right, They had a radiator on the right side of the aircraft and an oil cooler on the left side of the aircraft. And the coolers, so the heat exchangers, were partly buried in the wing and had inlets without boundary layer splitters or anything right ahead of them. And my calculations show that the boundary layer on the wing in particular, once it entered the inlet, it was facing an adverse pressure gradient. In other words, the pressure was increasing because of the radiator. And the radiator doesn't, it resists having flow go through it. So the pressure increases as you approach it, and the flow separates partway in. So why is that bad? Well, when flow separates, it loses total pressure, which is the very thing you're relying on to help cool your heat exchanger. So the cooling on the Spitfire was always kind of problematic, and for that regard in flight. Of course, on the ground, it had its other issues. As I note below that, the Hurricane and the Defiant One, they just had a radiator mounted on the center line, a little bit more conventional of an installation, but still, once again, the fuselage boundary layer was getting brought in, which wasn't the world's greatest thing. And then the Messerschmitt 109E and 110C had radiators under the wings. And as you can see, it was much like the Spitfire in terms of ingesting the wing boundary layer. It was a little more sophisticated in terms of exits. And Messerschmitt actually introduced a boundary layer splitter on the 109F that I don't show there, but they were aware that there were ways to improve the cooling of the aircraft. So these were kind of early attempts at trying to figure out cooling. Of course, the Messerschmitt, I'm sorry, the P-51 Mustang represents kind of the pinnacle where it was thought through, testing results were mixed into the design, and it's got an extremely good cooling system. As far as engines, there was actually a very interesting book coming out called The Secret Race for Horsepower that should be published this summer, if I'm right, which will, of course, lay bare a lot more information in this area. But the British aircraft, all three of them, relied on the Rolls-Royce Merlin II. It's a 27-liter V12 engine, and keep in mind, like the Subaru I have is 3.6 liters, and that's actually kind of a big automotive engine these days. 27-liter engine is huge when you consider that. It produced 1,000 horsepower at sea level, thereabouts. It had a single-stage, single-speed supercharger mounted on the back end of the engine and was direct driven by the crankshaft. Later in the war, Rolls-Royce developed first more advanced versions of that supercharger, and then later they came up with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that was used in the Merlin engine that's on the Mustang, which is it gave more power at high altitude, so it was really everyone's favor. And the British had access to 100-octane fuel, so they could run their engines at higher compression ratios or higher cylinder pressures without getting detonation or knocking, which is a great way to destroy an engine, is get detonation. The Germans, on the other hand, in all their aircraft that we're considering here, had the Daimler-Benz 601A engine. It was even bigger yet, 34 liters. It was inverted V12, and I'm not certain why they were so hung up on inverted engines. That's why I'm looking forward to the book that's coming out. Maybe I can learn the answer to that there. It produced about the same power as a Merlin, about a little, just shy of 1,100 horsepower at sea level, and it had a single-stage, single-speed supercharger, but they mounted it off to the side, as you can see in that lower image, and it had it driven by hydraulics, which was really cool. It's a neat way to solve the issue. And the Germans didn't have access to the fuel the British did. The British were getting 100-octane fuel from the United States and from other sources. The Germans were cut off from that fuel and had to produce everything internally. So they were restricted to 87-octane fuel, meaning they couldn't run at as high cylinder pressure or high power without getting detonation and knocking, which destroyed their engines. So that was always kind of a weak link for the Germans during the wars, is the low grade of fuel they had. So this gives you an idea of how the engine power varies with altitude. The blue and the red lines were Merlin 2 and 3 engines. The blue is with the normal boost of, or supercharger pressure of 6.25 psi, and then the red line is what they could go to overboost, as they called it, which is 12 psi. And you can see what that accomplishes is it gives you more power at sea level, and you can go up to about 9,000 feet before then the engine starts lapsing in power, and then it lapses up to altitude. If you went with the lower boost, you go to a higher altitude of about 16,000 feet, and then the power starts falling off. But the advantage of the high boost is you get power down low. the 601A, their boost was actually measured in atmospheres because the Germans at that point were fully on the metric system. The British weren't yet. And I show you down below that kind of the conversions. So effectively at 4.41 PSI a boost is their green line, which you can see starts breaking at about 5,000 feet. And then if they went to 5.88, they had more power near sea level. And I'm not certain why the line ends where it does. I think that might be where they were forced to switch over the boost. But the Merlins could run at the higher boost, partly due to the higher octane fuel that they were getting from the United States and from refineries in the Caribbean and whatnot. So it's been said that the higher octane fuel is one of the major factors in helping the British win the Battle of Britain. It could be argued it was one of the factors. I would tend to say there were a lot of factors that came into play. We'll discuss those in a moment. So this is a really big part of the story too, which was the radius of action. As I've mentioned, the 109E had a fairly limited range, 410 miles. And what I've done there is I've drawn 100 and 200 mile circles around German airfields out near Calais. And fundamentally what that means is the 109s, for instance, could go out to say somewhere between the first and second ring and maybe engaging air combat for a few minutes, and then they had to go back home before they ran out of fuel. So that really restricted them. It is known now that the Germans actually did have drop tanks, and no one really knows why they didn't actually use them, because that could have really helped out their radius of action. The British, on the other hand, despite having roughly the same radius of action, they were flying from their home airfields as interceptors. So fuel on board didn't matter as much because they mainly just had to get to altitude, attack German aircraft, pursue them a little bit, and then get home. So this was a real Achilles heel of the German aircraft. And in particular, you might notice the black arrow up high there, which is Luftflotte 5 coming in from Norway. That's even a longer range to reach Britain, and for that reason, most of that was being done with Messerschmitt 110s, which had the greater range, but of course was an inferior fighter, as we'll get to. As far as armament, the Spitfire and the Hurricane by spec had 8 30 caliber machine guns, and I show you with that arrow there with the bullet of the size of it, and it's about 1/3 of an inch in diameter and it's solid metal. So while it could do a lot of damage, so it was eclipsed by some of the other guns. For instance, like the P-51 Mustang had 50 caliber machine guns, which is a significantly bigger bullet, and so it could do greater damage. The Defiant had 4 30 calibers in the turret, but of course there were issues even then with employing them. The 109E had 2 machine guns in the cowling, 7.92 millimeter, which is roughly 30 cal. But they carried 2 20 millimeter cannon out in the wings. And I show the cannon shell there, and remember, they explode. So when they hit like fuel tanks and stuff, they could ignite them instead of just going right through them. The 110C was even more heavily armed, had 2 20 millimeter cannon, 4 roughly 30 caliber machine guns in the nose, and 1 aft facing for protecting the tail of the aircraft with the rear facing gunner. As far as visibility, which is another factor that came into play, as you can see on the Hurricane 1, it had a frame cockpit canopy. The framing obscures view, so when you're trying to look out for enemy fighters, there you have an area that you're blinded. It didn't have a lot of rearward visibility for looking over your shoulder, but it did have a rear view mirror that you can see up above the cockpit, which helped fill in that area and get the pilot's visibility. And if you think rear view mirrors are kind of archaic, if you go and look at modern fighters, you'll see them. They're not on the outside. They're usually inside the canopy bow, but you'll find them in F-4 Phantoms. I think they were there on the F-15, for instance, too. The British did have bullet-resistant glass, primarily in the front windshield. So that flat glass you can see up there was bullet-resistant. And Spitfire, in contrast, below it, you can see the bullet-resistant glass once again in the front, once again the rearview mirror, but they bulged the canopy. And you can see that on the Spitfire at the Historic Flight Foundation. That allowed the pilot to look over his shoulder much further and have better situational awareness of what was going on, particularly behind him. The 109E had a particularly heavy frame canopy. It was very tight, was hard to turn your head even, and had no rearview mirror. I don't know why they didn't ever introduce them. And Some had bullet-resistant glass windshields, some didn't. It kind of depended upon what production model mark they had and other factors like that. So the Spitfire, in terms of air combat, was much better in terms of the pilot being able to be aware of what was around him. Now, as far as tactical considerations, the British had a really big advantage. Radar had been developed all around the world at roughly the same time during the 30s. Japan and America, in Britain, in France, in Germany, and I think other countries too. But the British had real quickly realized it was a great way to develop situational awareness of what was going on in the airspace. So they developed these radar towers that were used in what they called the home chain radar system. It was around the shores of the UK, particularly facing towards the continent. And all of these were coupled into a centralized command and control center where all of the information from the different radar stations was brought and presented to the battle commander in a fairly organized fashion, so we can make decisions about what aircraft we're going to go where to combat enemy raids. In contrast, the Germans had radar too, but they didn't see fit to use it for monitoring air traffic so much as to monitor shipping. And that's actually what they mainly used their radar for. This radar was all ground-based. Only later in the war, with the development of the high-power magnetron, which was developed the U.S., I think by what became Raytheon, was the MIT radiation lab that developed it, that they finally got airborne radar that could do what they needed. And that's what, of course, was used in night fighters. As far as combat formations, this too made a difference. The British came up with what they called the fluid four, which you can see illustrated there. It's like the tips of your 4 fingers. This allowed mutual self-defense and support between all the aircraft, except, of course, tail end Charlie there on the right, who suffers a bit because he doesn't really have a wingman. Well, he does. He is the wingman to the guy to his left, but he doesn't have anyone really on the lookout for him. The British started out with other concepts, but real quickly caught on to the fluid four and picked it up too, and it was very effective. Another thing that was really important was sun position. And as I showed there, the pilots endeavored to be up sun of one another so that they were kind of hidden and they could stage attacks without being seen as they were coming in. And actually the British on their command and control maps in the command and control centers actually would plot where the sun was and try to maneuver their fighters up sun of the Germans at all times. But the mornings favored the Germans because now the sun was in the British eyes, and the afternoons favored the British because now the sun was in the eyes of the Germans. But both sides tried to make use of it as much as possible. Of course, hence the old saying, beware the Hun and the sun. Well, that's it. And you see it in that image there. So this is an illustration of the contrails from the high altitude combat. And by high altitude, I mean in the, say, 25,000 foot range over London. And of course, that's Big Ben right there, right along the Thames at Parliament. This is actually probably a little bit later because most of the Battle of Britain was fought south of London by and large. It was only when the Germans started bombing London that really the Battle of Britain came to an end because it was a major blunder of theirs. So we're going to be comparing maneuvering factors of the aircraft: level speed, rate of climb, turn radius, roll rate, the ability, diving capability, and the maximum service ceiling or ceiling that the airplane was capable of. As far as the combat pattern, the goal of the British fighters, of course, was always to get the altitude and be above the Germans so they could dive in on the formations. And usually the strategy was for the Spitfires to take on the Messerschmitt 109Es because they could maneuver with them, and for the Hurricanes to dive through all that and get at the bombers and shoot them down. So the Germans flew their escort fighters up above the bombers, and the bombers came in at about 16 to 20,000 feet, as I show there. So it was the British had being forewarned by their radar home chain, had the advantage they could actually get up to altitude and be above the German aircraft and combat them. And that was very important in the outcome of the battle too. So climb performance. This is the rate of climb that these different aircraft were capable of. And of course, the red line out at the right is a Hurricane on high boost. Had a very good rate of climb. As you can see that the boost was dialed back. The rate of climb down low was a lot less, but then once you hit about 16,000 feet, the two are about the same. The Spitfire is shown with it only at a low boost of 6.25. And of course, if you go to high boost, I don't know where the line sits, but obviously it's a lot better. And then the Defiant, of course, is kind of a lackluster one off to the left of it all. The 109E was about the equivalent of a Spitfire, as you can see, but it really didn't matter a lot because the 109E was at altitude by the time it got into combat. It climbed over France. So the only place it really needed great climb performance is if in the dogfight went vertical. And then lastly, you can see the Messerschmitt 110C, once again, like the Defiant, kind of off to the left and not that great in terms of rate of climb. And once again, it was pretty much envisioned as an escort fighter that would just stay close to the bombers and provide firepower. As far as level speed, this is a really interesting story now. The Spitfire is shown as being the fastest of these aircraft against altitude with high boost. You go to low boost and it falls off a bit. The Hurricane, well, you notice it's kind of off to the left there. It was a pretty draggy airframe. And even at high boost, it didn't do that great. The Defiant, of course, is kind of in the middle of it all. The Messerschmitt 109E was actually decently fast, but not as fast as the Spitfire. And of course, if you brought it up in boost, you did a little bit better, which is that orange line. And then lastly, we have mixed in, not looking too great, the 110C, which is a slow airplane, really. So this shows how the speed varies with altitude, and that's because the engine power, of course, is, as I noted on the previous slide, is holding fairly close to constant against altitude until you reach the critical altitude, then it's falling off. And that's exactly how you see the speeds falling off there too. So they're directly related to one another. Turn radius proved to be a really big factor in the air combat. So here we compare on a 14-second turn, level turn, a Spitfire, which is the red line on the inside, against a Messerschmitt 109E, which is the green line, a Hurricane, which I'm showing actually could turn inside the Messerschmitt to a degree. And then finally on the outside, the 110C, which wasn't that great. And being able to turn inside an enemy aircraft was really important. And I've also, the black lines are constant chunks of time. So you can see how much further around at any given point the Spitfire was able to get, which was a really big advantage in air combat. And one of the reasons that the Spitfire reigned supreme over the other aircraft. As far as roll rate, this is another interesting story. This is actual data. Some of it taken in Britain, some of it taken in the US by NACA. And what I'm showing here is the time to get to 45 seconds degree of bank, which is a measure of the roll rate you could achieve, and then plotting it against speed on the bottom. And as you can see, the fabric covered ailerons on the 109E and on the Spitfire kind of penalized them at higher speeds. And the reason why they had fabric covered ailerons is for balance, quite literally, because if you put metal covered ailerons on, the weight, the CG of the aileron now is further back and it's harder to balance them. And you end up having to use concentrated balance weights like a cobalt or things like that up front. But the Spitfire did go to metal covered ailerons, and you can see that down below, which is that magenta line. And that's what the Spitfire was able to achieve once they went to the metal covered ailerons on the Spitfire 5, which is a bit after the Battle of Britain. And there's stories actually of mixed formations of Spitfires with fabric and metal covered ailerons, where the leaders who had the metal covered ailerons had to be reminded that not everyone had ailerons like theirs. But that was essential for the Spitfires in their later fight against Focke-Wulf 190 when it became available to the Germans. And then we have diving, dive speed. As you can see, actually, the Messerschmitt 109E could dive at a fairly high speed, but it had control problems where the controls would get very heavy and the pilots would have trouble maneuvering the aircraft. The Spitfire, on the other hand, could dive to roughly the same speeds, but didn't have the problems. So it was very good at diving away from air combats where it might be in the disadvantage. The downside, as we'll get to, was the British had problems with engines cutting as they nosed over to dive because of issues of how the engines were carbureted. And we'll get to that in just a second here. So, well, yeah, next slide, of course. The issue was that the Rolls-Royce Merlin had a carburetor designed and manufactured by SU. And a carburetor has a float chamber with a float in it that controls the fuel metering. So what would happen is if a British pilot were just to push over and go to negative Gs, the float would float up in the chamber and the engine would cut out. And that's actually what happened. And the only way to initiate a dive and avoid this was to roll the airplane halfway and then pull. But the British ended up fixing this thanks to Beatrice Schilling, shown off to the left there, who worked at the RAE, who came up with the idea of a restrictor diaphragm, shown up here in the upper right. And this was put in the carb float chamber, and it was a baffle to keep the flow, keep the fuel from flowing off in negative G conditions. But it was really kind of a fix, a Band-Aid fix. The Germans, of course, had much better solution. Their Daimler-Benz 601A engine was fuel injected, something that we take for granted now, like most cars that are sold are fuel injected. And the reason the Germans could do this was Bosch, which is their manufacturer, had mastered precision machining necessary to build the metering pumps. Well, the British hadn't gotten there yet, or the Americans hadn't gotten there also. So the Messerschmitts could start their dives by simply pushing over and going negative G, which was a big advantage to them. Since this time, fuel injection has become very common because now this precision machining has become much more common. In terms of altitude performance, trying to get up above the other aircraft, as you can see, actually the Messerschmitt 109E was capable of actually going up to like 36,000 feet, which is really something. Maybe you really couldn't use that because of the lack of pressurized cockpits and stuff, but it had the capability. Otherwise, the British aircraft are capable of going up to like 34,000 feet, except for the Defiant, which is kind of a laggard, only being capable of lower altitudes. So in conclusion, the Defiant proved to be an ill-conceived concept. It had poor performance, as we've shown, and once the Germans realized it didn't have any guns in the wing, they developed tactics for fighting it and just basically slaughtered squadrons flying the Defiant. So they were all withdrawn from day combat in August 1940. They were used a bit for night fighting and then later became target tugs, which is kind of the ignominious end of fighters, you might say, become a target tug. The Messerschmitt 110C had really good firepower and range, but it lacked maneuverability. And the British were able to shoot down a lot of them. And the Germans, for that reason, started pulling them back as frontline fighters. And they were used as night fighters and in other roles throughout the war. The Spitfire 1 and Messerschmitt 109E were very closely matched. But the Messerschmitt, of course, as I noted, had insufficient fuel to really meet its mission requirements. And then the Hurricane, as I noted, it's kind of outclassed, but it was still useful for going after the bombers. And actually, one of the things that I'd like to do, which I haven't done yet, is do a presentation, much like my Korean War presentation, where I look at energy maneuverability for this aircraft, because I think a lot of this will be seen very simply in energy maneuverability diagrams like I prepared for the Korean War aircraft. Just a matter of time. So anyways, the outcome. The British lost about little over 1,500 aircraft, but because the crew were bailing out over home territory by and large and could easily be recovered, they lost only 544 air crew. The Germans, on the other hand, lost almost 1,900 aircraft there, and they lost almost 2,700 air crew, largely because if the pilots were shot down, they were coming down either over British territory, where they're taken prisoner, or over the North Sea, where, as I've noted before, if you went in the water, you stood a good chance of not making it. So they suffered rather heavily for that reason. So in the end, the defenders, the British, decisively defeated the potential invaders, the Germans, because the Germans weren't able to get air superiority that they needed. And the invasion of Britain never happened. And that's why we speak English, as they say. So anyways, why is all this important to me? So this shows the map of my father's journey, you might say. He was actually born in Antwerp, Belgium, which is where that yellow star is on the map on the left. And the day of the invasion of the lowlands, he woke up to the sound of what he thought was a jackhammer. He was 10 years old, and he looked out the window and he saw an airplane in flames falling from the sky. And of course, it was anti-aircraft fire he had heard. So he alerted his parents, and they fled to the coast at Depan and tried to hunker down there and realized quickly this wasn't just going to blow over. So they actually walked to the town of Dunkirk and passed through Dunkirk about 2 days before the Germans encircled the city, and took a French army truck down the coast to Abbeville and took a train to Paris, and then through other means of conveyance made it to the Spanish border. And fortunately, my grandfather had visas for them to transit Spain and go to Lisbon in Portugal, where they caught an ocean liner for Brazil in November 1940. So let's say instead of the Battle of Britain ending so decisively in the British favor, it ended in the Germans' favor. Well, Spain and Portugal were kind of sitting on the fence about whether or not to join the Axis. And if the Battle of Britain had gone the other way, there's a goodly chance that they would have joined the Axis, and my father's escape route would have been shut off. And if that had happened, he probably, because of the way the Jews were treated, he probably would not have survived like much of the rest of his family. So for that reason, I feel very fortunate that the Battle of Britain ended the way it did, because that's why I'm here. So anyways, where to see the aircraft? Because this is the best part. Of course, here at the Historic Flight Foundation, we have a Spitfire. It's a Mark 9, which dates from later in the war. And across the field at the Flying Heritage and Combat Armor Museum, that's right, they have a Mark 5C, which is also post-Battle of Britain, but at least a little closer in time to the Battle of Britain. And of course, they have a Hurricane that they managed to get. I believe it was out of Russia, if I remember right. It's a Sea Hurricane rather than a conventional in normal ground operations Hurricane, but it's one of the few left flying, and you get to see it fly too. And then if you want to see a Defiant, though, you have to go to the RAF Museum in Hendon, which is where the only Defiant is left. The rest are all scrapped. And of course, for a Messerschmitt 109E, you can go once again across the field to Flying Heritage. And that picture on the right shows the Flying Heritage Messerschmitt 109E leading on the right there, the Flying Heritage Spitfire, and on the left, the Historic Flight Foundation Spitfire. This was 3 or 4 summers ago. I forget how long ago. The only place in the world, literally, you could see a formation like that, which is incredible. And then as I note at the bottom here, if you want to see Messerschmitt 110C, there's several left in Europe. There's one at the RAF Museum in Hendon, and there's several others in Europe that you can see, but there's none flying. So we're truly blessed to have what's flying now at Payne Field. So that is the end of my talk for now. And if anyone has any questions, they can let me know, and that should do the trick. Thank you very much for listening through this.